Hello, Guy. Welcome back to my channel. For generations, we have told ourselves a simple and reassuring story about the dawn of civilization. First, we learned to farm. The stability of agriculture allowed us to settle in villages. These villages grew into towns and then into the first great cities. It was only then, with the surplus, the security, and the social structure of urban life, that our ancestors had the luxury of building temples and creating complex art. It is a neat, linear progression from the soil to the soul. But what if that story, the very foundation of our understanding of the past, is wrong? What if the temple came first? What if the immense, coordinated effort to build a sacred place was not a consequence of settled life, but its cause? On a remote, windswept hilltop in southern Turkey, a discovery was made that has completely overturned everything we thought we knew. This is the story of Göbekli Tepe. It is the story of a structure so ancient and so unexpectedly sophisticated that it has been called the birthplace of religion, the world's first cathedral, built by people who were, by all accounts, still living in the Stone Age. It is a mystery that is forcing us to unearth our own deepest origins. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins on a rounded, unassuming hilltop in the Jermuk mountain range of southeastern Anatolia, today part of modern Turkey. It is a lonely and exposed place, offering vast panoramic views across the biblical plains of Haran to the south and towards the Taurus Mountains to the north. For centuries, local shepherds have known this place by a simple, descriptive name, Göbekli Tepe, the Potbelly Hill. To them, it was just another feature in a timeless landscape, a place where their flocks could graze among the scattered limestone rocks and the lonely, gnarled branches of a single sacred wishing tree. For generations they would have walked over this hill, their feet treading upon the very tops of buried megaliths, entirely unaware of the world-changing secret that lay just centimeters beneath the soil. This hill, with its gentle, pregnant-looking swell, was the tomb of a lost world, a world so ancient and so unexpected that its rediscovery would send a shockwave through our entire understanding of human history. This is the story of how that tomb was finally opened. The first modern scholars to cast their eyes upon Göbekli Tepe did not recognize it for what it was. In the 1960s, a joint archaeological survey team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University was methodically combing the region, mapping ancient sites. They visited the hill, noted its prominent position, and saw the thousands upon thousands of flint flakes and tools that littered its surface. They also saw what they described as a disturbed cemetery, a place where large, broken slabs of limestone were scattered about, which they reasonably, but incorrectly, assumed were the remnants of ancient gravestones. They concluded that the site was likely a Byzantine or early Islamic outpost that had been built over a much older, but relatively insignificant, Stone Age flint workshop. They took their notes, published their survey, and moved on. The secret of Göbekli Tepe, having briefly revealed a clue, was dismissed and allowed to slumber for another 3 decades. The discovery was hidden in plain sight, waiting not just for a pair of eyes, but for a mind that was prepared to see it. That prepared mind belonged to a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt. By the early 1990s, Schmidt was already a seasoned and respected expert in the earliest periods of the Neolithic in the Near East. He had spent years excavating a remarkable site called Nevalli, a settlement only about 50 kilometers away from Göbekli Tepe and about 1,000 years younger. At Nevalli, Schmidt had unearthed a small, rectangular temple-like structure containing several tall, limestone pillars carved into a distinctive T shape, some with the faint outlines of arms carved on their sides. He had also become intimately familiar with the unique toolkit of the people of this era, the pre-pottery Neolithic, their distinctive flint arrowheads, scrapers, and blades. He knew that these early people, who were just beginning to experiment with settled life and farming, were capable of a level of symbolic expression and monumental construction that was far more sophisticated than previously believed. His work at Nevalli had given him a unique intellectual key, a mental template for what a ritual site from this distant epoch should look like. In 1994, while searching for a new site to excavate, Schmidt came across the old survey report from the 1960s that mentioned the hill, with the vast quantities of flint. Intrigued, he decided to pay a visit. He made his way to the lonely, pot-bellied hill and began to walk its surface. What he saw immediately electrified him. The sheer quantity and density of the flint debris was unlike anything he had ever seen at a simple settlement. The entire surface of the hill, over an area of some 300 meters in diameter, was a carpet of flint flakes, cores, and finished tools. This was not a place where a few people had occasionally made their tools. This was an industrial-scale workshop, a place of immense and sustained activity over a vast period of time. He recognized the types of flint tools immediately, the Birthplace and Neolithic, points as belonging to the very earliest phase of the pre-pottery Neolithic. This was not a medieval site. This was a place where Stone Age people had gathered in immense numbers for a very long time to work stone, and then he saw them. The broken slabs of limestone that the earlier survey had dismissed as simple grave markers. To Klaus Schmidt's trained eye, they were anything but. He recognized the distinctive quarried shapes. He saw the tops of several massive T-shaped pillars, identical in form to the smaller ones he had excavated at Nevalli, sticking out of the top of the hill. In that single, breathtaking moment of recognition, the entire story changed. This was not a cemetery. These were not gravestones. This was a site of monumental megalithic pillars, far larger and almost certainly far older than his own discoveries at Nevalli. He later described the feeling. It was as if he had been struck by lightning. He knew in that instant that he had two choices. He could walk away and tell no one, and the hill would keep its secret for another generation, or he could spend the rest of his life working on this single spot. In that moment, standing alone on that windy, forgotten hilltop, Klaus Schmidt made his choice. He had found his destiny. Schmidt immediately knew the immense significance of his discovery and moved quickly to secure the site. He forged a partnership between the German Archaeological Institute, for whom he worked, and the local Unearthing Museum. In 1995, just a year after his initial visit, the first full-scale excavations at Göbekli Tepe began. The logistical challenges were immense. The hilltop was remote, with no running water or electricity. The team had to establish a base camp, organize a team of local workmen, and begin the slow, painstaking process of removing the topsoil that had accumulated over millennia. Archaeology is not a treasure hunt. It is a slow, methodical process of deconstruction, where every layer of soil, every stone, and every artifact is meticulously recorded, mapped and photographed before it is removed. Schmidt knew that the hill was a unique and priceless archive of a lost world, and that to excavate it was to read a book that could never be unread. His approach was one of extreme care and scientific rigor, a commitment to preserving as much information as possible for the future. The first major revelations emerged quickly. As the team began to clear the southern slope of the hill, the outlines of immense circular structures began to appear. The first to be substantially uncovered was a great ring of standing stones, which the team labeled Enclosure B. As they dug deeper, the full, astonishing form was revealed. It was a roughly circular enclosure, about 10 meters in diameter, defined by a series of tall, T-shaped limestone pillars embedded in a rough stone wall. These perimeter pillars were smaller, but they were all oriented to face inwards towards the center of the circle. And in the center, standing parallel to each other, were two even larger, more massive T-shaped pillars that dominated the entire structure. The architectural grammar of the site was immediately apparent, a circle of smaller monoliths, all watching a central, dominant pair. As the work continued, another similar enclosure, Enclosure A, was found nearby. It was clear that this was not a single isolated structure, but a complex of multiple, similar buildings. The sheer scale of the engineering involved was difficult to comprehend. The central pillars of Enclosure B were over 4 meters tall and weighed several tons each. And these were not even the largest. As the excavations expanded, it became clear that the builders of Göbekli Tepe had worked on a truly monumental scale. The pillars were not rough, unworked stones. They were hewn from the limestone bedrock of the surrounding plateau, in some cases in quarries located hundreds of meters away from the main site. Archaeologists have found the massive, T-shaped trenches in the bedrock where these monoliths were carved out. The process was a feat of Stone Age engineering. The builders would have used simple flint chisels and stone pounders to painstakingly carve deep channels around the outline of the pillar. They would then have used levers and immense manpower to crack the multi-ton block free from the bedrock. The transport of these massive stones from the quarry to the construction site, and the process of raising them into their vertical positions, would have required a huge coordinated workforce, using nothing more than ropes, wooden rollers, and a sophisticated understanding of leverage and mechanics. But the most shocking revelation of all was the site's immense age. To establish a chronology, Schmidt's team used a technique of radiocarbon dating. They were able to collect samples of organic material charcoal from ancient fires and animal bones that had been left in the fill that deliberately buried the structures. The results that came back from the laboratory were staggering, almost unbelievable. The main monumental layers of Göbekli Tepe, the great circular enclosures dated to a period between 9,600 and 8,200 BCE. This placed the site in the 10th and 9th millennia before the Common Era. To put this date in context is to feel a sense of profound historical vertigo. This means that the great temples at Göbekli Tepe were built some 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. They were 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. They were built at the very end of the last ice age, a time when much of the northern hemisphere was still covered in glaciers. This was the era of the pre-pottery Neolithic, a time when humanity had not yet invented pottery, had not yet mastered metallurgy, and, most crucially, had not yet domesticated plants or animals. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were, by all traditional definitions, Stone Age hunter-gatherers. As the years of excavation continued, the discoveries became even more spectacular. The team uncovered two more major enclosures, Enclosure C and Enclosure D, which were even older, larger, and more complex than the first two. Enclosure D, in particular, is the masterpiece of the site as we know it today. It is a vast oval-shaped structure, over 20 meters in diameter. Its two central pillars are colossal, standing over 5.5 meters tall and weighing an estimated 10 tons each. The quality of the stonework is breathtaking. The pillars are not rough-hewn but are carefully shaped and finished. The floor of the enclosure was not simple dirt. It was made of a kind of terrazzo, a polished, concrete-like surface, created by burning limestone to make plaster, a technology that was not thought to have been invented until thousands of years later. In the walls between the pillars were benches, suggesting that people gathered within these spaces for some kind of communal activity. Unearthing Enclosure D was like pulling back a curtain to reveal a lost civilization, one that possessed an artistic and engineering sophistication that simply should not have existed at that point in time. What truly transformed the site from a mere architectural wonder into a symbolic universe was the discovery that the pillars themselves were not just pillars. As the team carefully cleaned the surfaces of the great monoliths, particularly the two central pillars of Enclosure D, a stunning revelation came to light. Carved in very low relief on the narrow edges of the pillars were the unmistakable outlines of human arms, with long, slender fingers that wrapped around the front of the pillar, their hands meeting just above a carved belt or girdle. Below the belt, some pillars feature the carving of a fox-pelt loincloth. The T-shape was not an abstract symbol. It was a body. The wide top of the T was a highly stylized, abstract representation of a human head in profile, and the tall shaft was the torso. The enclosures were not just rings of stone. They were gatherings of monumental, stylized, human-like beings, their faceless heads gazing inwards towards the central pair who stood like the lords of the assembly. Göbekli Tepe was not a temple in the sense of a house for a god. It was a congregation of gods, or ancestors, or some other form of powerful supernatural beings rendered in stone. For years, the team focused their efforts on excavating these first 4 enclosures on the southern slope. But Klaus Schmidt knew that what they had uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. To understand the true scale of the site without spending centuries digging, the team turned to non-invasive survey techniques, primarily geomagnetic prospection and ground-penetrating radar. These technologies allow archaeologists to see what lies beneath the ground by measuring subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field, or by sending radar pulses into the soil and reading their reflections. The results of these surveys were mind-boggling. They revealed that the entire hilltop, over an area of more than 22 acres, was an artificial mound, a tell, created by human activity. And buried within that mound, the survey data clearly showed the ghostly outlines of at least 16 more massive, megalithic enclosures, many of them even larger than the ones that had already been excavated. The 4 enclosures that had so astonished the world were just a small, and perhaps not even the most important, part of a vast and sprawling sacred complex. The true extent of Göbekli Tepe was almost unimaginable. This vast body of evidence led Klaus Schmidt to formulate his revolutionary and now widely accepted hypothesis. Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement. The almost total lack of domestic structures, the absence of a nearby water source, and the scarcity of everyday cooking hearths all pointed away from a place of permanent habitation. This was, he argued, a sacred site, a cathedral on a hill. It was a place of pilgrimage, a central ritual hub for the hunter-gatherer groups who roamed across a vast territory of hundreds of square kilometers. For generations, perhaps for millennia, these scattered, mobile bands of people would have periodically gathered here, at this special sacred mountain, to participate in communal rituals, to exchange goods and information, to arrange marriages, and to reaffirm their shared cultural and spiritual identity. And the central activity of these gatherings was the act of building itself. Each group may have been responsible for quarrying and erecting a pillar, or for constructing an entire enclosure. As a monumental act of piety and social cohesion, the choice of the location was almost certainly deliberate. The Potbelly Hill is the highest point on the Jermuk mountain range, a natural landmark that is visible from many miles away. From its summit, one has a commanding 360-degree view of the surrounding landscape. To the south stretches the vast Harran Plain, one of the cradles of agriculture. To the north lie the volcanic mountains of the Karakadak, a rich source of obsidian, and the Taurus Mountains, a source of game and other resources. The hill stands at a natural nexus point between the Mesopotamian lowlands and the Anatolian highlands. For the mobile hunter-gatherer groups who exploited these different ecological zones throughout the year, Göbekli Tepe would have been a natural and powerful central point, a neutral ground where different social groups could come together. Its very prominence in the landscape would have given it a sacred character, a place closer to the sky and the gods. Klaus Schmidt dedicated nearly 20 years of his life to unearthing the secrets of Göbekli Tepe. His work, and the work of the international team he led, fundamentally transformed our understanding of the human past. When he died suddenly and unexpectedly in 2014, the world lost a true archaeological visionary. His work had demonstrated, beyond any doubt, that hunter-gatherer societies were capable of a level of social organization, engineering skill, and symbolic thought that had previously been considered the exclusive domain of settled agricultural civilizations. He had flipped the traditional narrative of the Neolithic revolution on its head. It was not agriculture that led to complex society and religion. It was the intense social and logistical demands of a complex, religious project that may have been the very catalyst that spurred the invention of agriculture. The temple, it seemed, had come before the town, the great mystery that Klaus Schmidt work uncovered was not just who these people were and what they believed, but what compelled them to undertake such a monumental, generation-spanning project. The discovery of the world's first cathedral had opened a new and profound set of questions about the very nature of the human journey. To stand within the excavated enclosures of Göbekli Tepe is to be confronted by a silent stone congregation. The great T-shaped pillars, with their stylized human forms, gather in their eternal, circular assemblies, their faceless heads gazing inwards. But these beings are not alone. Their bodies, the broad surfaces of the pillars, are covered in a teeming, vibrant, and deeply mysterious world of images. This is not crude graffiti. This is a sophisticated and powerful artistic canon, a sacred picture book from the end of the last ice age. The pillars are alive with a menagerie of creatures, carved in crisp, confident, high relief. Sinuous snakes, snarling foxes, powerful wild boars, and long-legged birds. This is the art of a people who were, above all else, hunters. It is an art born from a deep, intimate, and unsentimental knowledge of the animal world, a world of predators and prey, of venom and power, of life and death. To explore the art of Göbekli Tepe is to enter the mind of the Neolithic hunter, to see the world through their eyes, and to grapple with the complex, alien symbolism of a belief system that has been silent for 12,000 years. The sheer artistic skill of the Göbekli Tepe carvers is the first thing that strikes any observer. This is not the primitive, hesitant work of a culture just learning to express itself. The lines are confident, the forms are dynamic, and the understanding of anatomy is remarkable. The artists were masters of the high-relief technique. Instead of simply incising an outline into the stone, they would painstakingly lower the entire background surface, leaving the figure of the animal projecting boldly outwards from the pillar. This creates a powerful play of light and shadow, giving the creatures a three-dimensional, almost living quality. To achieve this with the simple tools available to them, flint burins for carving and hard stone pounders for dressing the background, would have required immense skill, patience, and a clear artistic vision. Each pillar was a major artistic undertaking, a masterpiece that would have taken a master carver a considerable amount of time to complete. The quality and consistency of the art across the different enclosures suggests the existence of a formal artistic tradition, a school of artisans who had perfected their craft and passed their skills and symbolic vocabulary down through generations. The most common and perhaps most significant animal depicted at Göbekli Tepe is the serpent. Snakes are everywhere. They are shown slithering up the sides of pillars, often in dense, writhing groups. They are depicted with a powerful, almost aggressive energy, their forms sinuous and full of life. In many cultures around the world, the snake is a deeply ambivalent symbol. Its ability to shed its skin makes it a powerful symbol of rebirth, transformation, and immortality. Its venom makes it a symbol of death and danger. Its connection to the earth associates it with chthonic, underworld deities and fertility. It is likely that the snakes at Göbekli Tepe carried all of these potent, contradictory meanings. Their prevalence suggests that they played a central role in the mythology and ritual of the site's builders. They may have been seen as guardians of the sacred space, as messengers between the worlds of the living and the dead, or as a representation of a powerful primal life force. Their silent, slithering forms are the most dominant and persistent motif in this Stone Age sanctuary. Another group of animals that appears with striking frequency are those that we might associate with cunning, aggression, and the dangers of the wild. The fox is a particularly common image. The carvings often depict a male fox, its tail bushy, and its expression almost a snarl. Wild boars are also a major theme. These are not domestic pigs, but powerful, tusked, and notoriously aggressive wild boars depicted with a raw, muscular energy. These are not the primary animals that the people of Göbekli Tepe were hunting for food. The faunal remains show that their diet was overwhelmingly dominated by gazelle. The choice to depict these specific, dangerous predators was therefore a symbolic one. It is possible that these animals represented certain human qualities, perhaps the cunning of the hunter or the aggression of the warrior. They may also have been the emblems or totems of specific social groups, a fox clan or a boar clan, who gathered at the site. Alternatively, they may have been seen as malevolent, demonic forces, their images carved onto the pillars to ward off evil, or to be controlled through ritual. Whatever their meaning, they give the art of Göbekli Tepe a distinctly menacing, almost threatening quality. This bestiary of dangerous creatures continues with other powerful predators. While less common, there are depictions of lions and leopards, the apex predators of the ancient Near Eastern landscape. These great cats are rendered with a fearsome intensity. There are also birds of prey, eagles and vultures, creatures of the sky associated with power and, in the case of vultures, with death and the excarnation of the dead. The presence of these formidable animals reinforces the sense that the symbolic world of Göbekli Tepe was a wild and untamed one. It was a world viewed through the eyes of a hunter, a world defined by a deep and respectful fear of the power of the natural world. The art is not a pastoral scene of gentle harmony. It is a vision of a cosmos filled with powerful, dangerous, and unpredictable animal spirits, in stark contrast to these aggressive predators. The pillars also feature a beautiful and diverse array of birds. The most common are long-legged wading birds, such as cranes and storks. These are often depicted in elegant, processional rows, their long necks and graceful forms rendered with a surprising delicacy. Waterfowl, such as ducks and geese, are also present. These birds, associated with the life-giving water of the rivers and marshes, may have represented a different aspect of the cosmos, perhaps fertility, migration, or the changing of the seasons. The crane, in particular, is a bird known for its elaborate and noisy mating dances, and it is possible that these carvings are related to communal rituals or dances that took place within the enclosures. The juxtaposition of these graceful, long-legged birds with the snarling foxes and aggressive boars creates a complex and balanced symbolic ecosystem, a world of both danger and elegance, of both earth and sky. The world of insects and arachnids is also represented, though less frequently. There are clear depictions of scorpions, another creature whose venomous sting would have made it a powerful symbol of death and danger. Spiders are also occasionally found. These smaller, but no less potent, creatures add another layer of complexity to the symbolic menagerie. Their inclusion suggests that the builders of Göbekli Tepe had a comprehensive cosmology, one that included not just the great and powerful beasts, but the entire spectrum of life, from the largest aurochs to the smallest scorpion. Each creature, no matter its size, likely had its own place and its own story within their grand mythological system. The artists were not just carving animals. They were mapping their entire symbolic universe onto the stone pillars. One of the most profound mysteries of the site's art is what is not there. The animal remains from the feasting debris show that the people of Göbekli Tepe hunted and ate a wide variety of animals, with gazelle being by far the most common. Yet the gazelle, the primary source of their sustenance, is almost entirely absent from the art on the main pillars. This is a stunning omission, and it tells us something vital about the purpose of the art. The artists were not simply depicting the world around them or making a record of their daily life. This was not art for art's sake. They were making a very specific and deliberate selection of images. The animals chosen for depiction were chosen for their symbolic power, not for their economic importance. The art of Göbekli Tepe is a religious text, not a dietary menu. It is concerned with the world of myth, of spirit, and of power, not the mundane world of the daily hunt. While the art is overwhelmingly dominated by these animal figures, there are a few rare and deeply enigmatic depictions of human beings. These are almost always portrayed in a strangely abstract or fragmented way, in stark contrast to the lively naturalism of the animal carvings. On some of the smaller stone plaques found at the site, there are incised images of naked women in a splayed, birthing posture. These are reminiscent of the much later mother goddess figurines found at Neolithic sites like Cathedral, and they may represent a link to older fertility cults. But on the main pillars, the human form is treated very differently. One of the most haunting images is a relief carving on a pillar in enclosure D that shows a headless human body, its phallus erect, flanked by two vultures. This powerful and disturbing scene has been widely interpreted as a depiction of a specific funerary rite, known as excarnation, where the body of the deceased is left exposed to be stripped of its flesh by birds of prey before the bones are collected for burial. This was a common practice in many ancient cultures, and the scene at Göbekli Tepe may be the earliest known depiction of this sky burial ritual. The pillars themselves, as we have seen, are the most dominant and powerful representation of the human form at the site. Their T-shape is a stylized anthropomorphic representation of a human, with the crossbar as a faceless head and the shaft as the body. The low-relief carvings of arms, hands, belts, and loincloths make this identification certain. But these are not portraits of specific individuals. They are generic, monumental, and impersonal beings. Their lack of faces is almost certainly a deliberate choice. It suggests that they are not meant to be seen as mere mortals. They are something else, ancestors, deities, or a new and powerful class of supernatural beings that were the focus of the cult at Göbekli Tepe. They are human in form, but superhuman in scale and in their faceless anonymity. The entire architectural space is a gathering of these silent stone giants, their stylized bodies serving as the very canvas for the animal world they seem to preside over. The arrangement of the art on the pillars also seems to be deliberate and meaningful. The two massive central pillars in each enclosure are the most important and are often the most elaborately decorated. They frequently feature the most potent symbols, such as the foxpelt loincloth. The smaller perimeter pillars often have a single, dominant animal carved on their front face, the one facing into the center of the circle. This has led some to speculate that each pillar may have represented a specific social group, such as a clan or a lineage, and that the animal was its totem or emblem. An enclosure might therefore represent a gathering of these different clans, their symbolic pillars arranged around the two central, dominant figures who might represent a pair of founding ancestors or primordial deities. This interpretation would make the architecture of Göbekli Tepe a kind of social diagram, a map of their kinship and political relationships. Rendered in stone, another layer of symbolism is found in the few abstract signs that are interspersed among the animal reliefs. These include symbols like the H sign, both upright and rotated, crescents, and discs. The meaning of these abstract symbols is completely lost to us, but their repeated and deliberate placement suggests that they were part of a recognized symbolic system. They are not random doodles. It is tempting to see these as a form of proto-writing, but there is no evidence that they represent the sounds of a language. It is more likely that they were ideograms or pictograms with a shared cultural meaning, a kind of sacred glyph that was understood by the initiates of the cult. The crescent, for instance, could represent the moon, while the disk could represent the sun. If so, this would suggest that the cosmology of Göbekli Tepe included a celestial dimension, an interest in the cycles of the sun and moon, which would be a precursor to the later development of astronomy and calendar systems. Some researchers have taken this astronomical connection even further, proposing a theory of astroarchaeology at Göbekli Tepe. They have suggested that the circular enclosures are not randomly oriented, but are aligned to specific points on the horizon, marking the rising or setting of certain significant stars or constellations at the time they were built. One theory, for example, proposes that the central pillars of some enclosures are aligned with the rising of the star Sirius, which held immense importance for the later ancient Egyptians. Another more complex theory suggests that some of the animal carvings, particularly the famous vulture stone in enclosure D, are not just pictures of animals, but are in fact a complex star map, a date stamp depicting a specific configuration of constellations that corresponds to the cataclysmic Younger Dryas impact event, a controversial theory that a comet strike around 10,900 BCE triggered a brief return to Ice Age conditions. While these astronomical theories are highly speculative and not widely accepted by mainstream archaeologists, they highlight the tantalizing possibility that the people of Göbekli Tepe had a far more sophisticated understanding of the cosmos than we have ever imagined. The vulture stone, or Pillar 43, deserves special attention, as it is by far the most complex and narrative scene yet discovered at the site. It is a dense and busy composition that seems to tell a story. The upper part of the pillar is dominated by a large vulture, which seems to be holding or guarding a disk or sphere with its wing. Below the vulture is the headless ithyphallic human figure we have already discussed. The scene is teeming with other figures. Another large bird, a scorpion, and the faint outlines of other creatures. The entire composition is so unusual and so specific that it feels like a depiction of a particular myth or a cosmological event. It is the closest thing we have at Göbekli Tepe to a written text. The meaning is lost, but the intent to communicate a complex narrative is clear. This single pillar is a powerful testament to the rich and sophisticated mythological world of these Stone Age people, a world that we can see only in enigmatic fragments. The art of Göbekli Tepe is not confined to the great pillars. The excavators have found a number of smaller, freestanding sculptures carved in the round. These are even more remarkable in their naturalism. One of the most famous is a life-sized human head discovered in the fill of one of the enclosures. Its jaw is broken, but the remaining features are surprisingly realistic. This is a rare glimpse of how these people may have seen themselves. There are also numerous animal sculptures, including a powerful, life-sized statue of a wild boar, and smaller, more portable figures of predators. These sculptures would have likely been placed within the enclosures as part of the ritual paraphernalia. Unlike the reliefs which are fixed to the architecture, these were movable objects that could be used and interacted with during ceremonies. They add another dimension to our understanding of the ritual life of the site. A life that was filled not just with static images, but with three-dimensional, powerful representations of the spirits of their world. One crucial aspect of the art is its overwhelming maleness. The vast majority of the animals depicted, the foxes, the boars, the lions, are clearly male. The stylized human figures of the pillars themselves, with their belts and loincloths, are also gendered as male, and the few explicit human depictions, like the headless figure on the vulture stone, are also male. The splayed female figures are found only on smaller, secondary stone plaques, not on the great pillars themselves. This has led many researchers to conclude that the cult at Göbekli Tepe was a predominantly male affair. It may have been a center for male initiation rites, for the rituals of hunting bands, or for a patriarchal ancestor cult. The world depicted on the stones is a world of male aggression, of hunting, and of power. This stands in stark contrast to the later Neolithic sites like Cathedral, where the symbolism is overwhelmingly dominated by female figures and imagery. The art of Göbekli Tepe seems to capture a specific, male-centric, and perhaps even misogynistic worldview, one that would be challenged and transformed as society moved towards agriculture and settled life. The meaning of this complex symbolic system remains, and will likely always remain, a subject of debate. Klaus Schmidt himself believed that the art was fundamentally shamanistic. He saw the enclosures as ritual spaces where shamans would enter a trance state and journey to the spirit world, a world inhabited by the powerful animal spirits depicted on the pillars. The T-shaped pillars, in his view, might represent the shamans themselves, their bodies acting as a portal to this other world. The animals were not just pictures, but spirit guides, demons, and powerful forces that the shaman had to confront and control. This is a compelling interpretation, as shamanism is a common feature of many hunter-gatherer societies around the world. The art of Göbekli Tepe, with its focus on powerful animals and its strange, otherworldly atmosphere, certainly fits well within a shamanistic framework. An alternative, though not mutually exclusive, theory is that the pillars represent revered ancestors. In many cultures, powerful leaders or the founders of a lineage are deified after their death and become the focus of a cult. The monumental, stylized, and impersonal figures of the T-pillars could be representations of these primordial ancestors, the founding fathers of the different clans who gathered at the site. The animals carved on their bodies might represent their spirit guides, their emblems, or the stories of their legendary deeds. The enclosures would then be great family reunions, where the living members of the clan would gather in the presence of their powerful, deified ancestors to perform rituals and to reaffirm their kinship and their place in the world. This interpretation would explain the monumental, communal nature of the site and its clear function as a center for social gathering. Whatever the specific meaning, it is clear that the art of Göbekli Tepe was designed to create an awe-inspiring and overwhelming sensory experience. We must imagine the site not as a silent, sterile ruin, but as a living, breathing ritual theater. We must imagine the great stone pillars, perhaps brightly painted, their carved animals seeming to leap from the surface in the flickering light of torches or a central bonfire. We must imagine the sounds, the chanting of priests, the rhythm of drums, the roar of a crowd gathered for a feast. We must imagine the smells, the incense, the roasting meat, the spilled beer. The art was not just something to be looked at. It was the backdrop for a powerful, multi-sensory, and transformative ritual experience. It was designed to impress, to intimidate, and to transport the participant from the mundane world of daily life into the sacred, mythological world of the gods and ancestors. The artistic tradition of Göbekli Tepe did not die with the site. In the centuries and millennia that followed its deliberate burial, we see clear echoes of its unique art and architecture in the smaller, village-based settlements that sprang up in the surrounding region, such as Nevali, Kori, and Kayan. These sites also feature T-shaped pillars, though they are much smaller and are integrated into domestic and communal buildings. They also feature sculptures and carvings that are clearly part of the same symbolic universe. The legacy of Göbekli Tepe was not erased. It was domesticated. The great regional cathedral was replaced by smaller local parish churches, but the core eye of the belief system seems to have endured. This continuity is crucial, as it shows that Göbekli Tepe was not a strange, isolated anomaly, but the spectacular epicenter of a long and widespread cultural tradition that shaped the entire region for thousands of years. It was the wellspring of a symbolic language that would continue to be spoken long after its great central sanctuary had been laid to rest. We have explored the discovery of this impossible place and have marveled at its strange and beautiful art. But now we must confront the central, confounding mystery of Göbekli Tepe, the paradox that strikes at the very heart of our traditional understanding of the past. Who were the people who built this cathedral on a hill? And how, in an age before the wheel, before metal tools, and before the organized labor forces of a settled agricultural state, did they manage to achieve such a monumental feat of engineering? The answer, which the archaeology of the site makes unequivocally clear, is as revolutionary as the site itself. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not farmers, not city dwellers, not the subjects of a powerful king. They were hunter-gatherers. They were people of the Stone Age who lived in mobile bands, who followed the wild herds, and who gathered the wild plants of the landscape. The implications of this fact are profound. It forces us to completely re-evaluate our long-held assumptions about the capabilities of primitive societies and to imagine a new and far more complex picture of the world at the dawn of the Neolithic age. For over a century, the dominant model for the rise of civilization has been built upon the foundation of the Neolithic Revolution. In this model, the invention of agriculture was the great catalyst. Farming provided a stable and predictable food source, which allowed mobile hunter-gatherers to settle down in permanent villages. This sedentary life, in turn, led to population growth, the accumulation of surplus wealth, and the division of labor. This created a hierarchical social structure, with a priestly and ruling class that could organize and command the labor of the populace to build large-scale projects like irrigation systems, city walls, and eventually temples. In this story, monumental architecture is a late development, a luxury afforded only by a mature, complex agricultural society. Göbekli Tepe tears this neat, linear narrative to shreds. Dated to a time before the widespread domestication of either plants or animals, it presents us with the end product, a massive, complex, ritual monument without the supposed prerequisite cause. It gives us the temple before the town, the cathedral before the culture of farming that was supposed to be its necessary foundation. The evidence for the hunter-gatherer identity of the builders is overwhelming and comes from a detailed analysis of the organic remains found at the site. Archaeobotanists have painstakingly sifted through tons of excavated soil, and they have found no evidence of domesticated grains. What they have found are the remains of wild einkorn wheat, wild barley, and wild pistachio and almond nuts. These are the plants that grew naturally on the hillsides of the region, and they were harvested from the wild, not cultivated in fields. Similarly, archaeologists have analyzed the tens of thousands of animal bones found at the site, the debris from countless feasts. The bones are almost exclusively from wild species. The most common by a huge margin is the gazelle, followed by the aurochs, the massive wild ancestor of modern cattle, wild boar, and wild sheep. There are no signs of domesticated sheep, goats, or cattle, the telltale signs of a pastoralist economy. The people of Göbekli Tepe were not herders. They were highly organized and very successful hunters. Their toolkit, of which hundreds of thousands of examples have been found, tells the same story. It is a classic pre-pottery Neolithic flint toolkit, but one of exceptional quality and specialization. There are thousands of finely made arrowheads, primarily of the Birthplace and Menagerie point types, the high-tech weaponry of the late Paleolithic and early Neolithic hunter. There are also numerous scrapers for processing animal hides, burins for carving stone and bone, and blades for a variety of cutting tasks. What is notably absent are the tools associated with the farming life. There are no polished stone axes for clearing forests, and very few of the heavy grinding stones, saddle querns, that would be needed for processing large quantities of cultivated grain. The stone tool evidence points unequivocally to a society whose economy was still firmly rooted in the exploitation of wild resources. They were hunter-gatherers, but they were hunter-gatherers at the absolute peak of their technological and organizational capacity. This was not a world of impoverished, isolated bands of people struggling for survival. The environment of the Fertile Crescent at the end of the last ice age was, for a time, a kind of paradise for hunters. The climate was becoming warmer and wetter, and the landscape was a rich mosaic of grasslands, open forests of pistachio and oak, and rivers teeming with life. This environment supported vast herds of gazelle, wild sheep, and other game. It was a world of abundance. This natural bounty allowed the hunter-gatherer populations of the region to become what archaeologists call affluent foragers. They were so successful at exploiting their rich environment that they could afford to do something that was previously thought to be impossible for foragers. They could begin to settle down. While some groups may have still been fully mobile, the evidence from other sites in the region suggests that many were living in semi-permanent or even permanent villages for much of the year, all without the benefit of full-scale agriculture. This new, settled hunter-gatherer lifestyle was the social and economic context in which the astonishing project of Göbekli Tepe could be conceived. But even for a society of affluent foragers, the construction of Göbekli Tepe represents a logistical and social challenge of an almost unimaginable scale. The first and most fundamental task was the quarrying of the great limestone pillars. The builders had to locate a source of high-quality limestone, a sedimentary rock that was hard enough to hold its shape and its carvings, but soft enough to be worked with their available tools. They found this on the limestone plateau on which the site itself is built. In the quarries, which are located just a few hundred meters from the main enclosures, we can see the process frozen in time. They began by clearing the loose topsoil and weathered surface rock. Then, using heavy, pointed flint tools and possibly wooden mallets, the quarrymen would begin to pound and chip away a deep, narrow trench about 20 centimeters wide around the outline of the desired pillar. It was a slow, grueling, and percussive process. The rhythmic sound of stone on stone echoing across the plateau for months on end. Once the trenches were deep enough, defining the T-shape of the pillar on all its upper sides, the final and most critical stage of extraction began. The pillar was still attached to the bedrock at its base. How did they break it free? We can see the tool marks at the bottom of the trenches, evidence of a process of undercutting. They would have had to chip away at the base, a difficult and awkward task in the narrow confines of the trench. It is also highly likely that they employed the power of thermal expansion and contraction, perhaps by building fires along the base, and then dousing the hot rock with cold water to create a thermal shock that would crack it. Another possibility is the use of wooden wedges. By carving holes along the base, hammering in dry wooden wedges, and then soaking them with water, the immense, slow, and irresistible force of the swelling wood could have been sufficient to crack the multi-ton monolith free from the bedrock. Whatever the exact method, it was a moment of high drama and immense danger, the culmination of a vast expenditure of coordinated labor. The transport of these massive pillars from the quarry to the construction site was the next great challenge. The largest pillars at Göbekli Tepe weigh between 10 and 20 tons, and one unfinished giant left in the quarry is estimated to weigh over 50 tons. These are weights that would challenge modern engineers with cranes and heavy machinery. How did a people with no wheels and no domesticated draft animals, no oxen, no donkeys move these colossal stones? The answer must lie in the organized and disciplined application of human muscle power. The pillar would have been carefully lowered onto a wooden sledge or a series of rollers. A path would have been cleared from the quarry to the building site, and then a massive team of people, perhaps several hundred strong, would have been assembled to haul the great stone, inch by agonizing inch, using ropes made from twisted flax or animal hides. It would have required a leader, an ancient foreman or engineer, to direct the work, to coordinate the pulling, and to manage the immense logistical operation. The sight of several hundred people, all straining in unison to move a single massive stone, would have been a powerful and awe-inspiring spectacle, a physical manifestation of the community's collective power and shared purpose. Once the pillar arrived at the designated enclosure, it had to be raised into its final vertical position. This was another feat of sophisticated, low-tech engineering. The builders likely dug a large pit at the spot where the pillar was to stand, with one side of the pit forming a steep earthen ramp. The base of the pillar would have been carefully maneuvered to the edge of this pit. Then, using a combination of pushing from behind and pulling on ropes from the front, the massive stone would have been tilted, slowly and carefully, until it overbalanced and slid down the ramp, its base coming to rest at the bottom of the pit. Once in the pit, it would have been at a steep angle, but not yet vertical. The final and perhaps most dangerous part of the operation was to haul it into its fully upright position. This was likely done using a system of wooden A-frames, levers, and ropes. As the pillar was pulled upright, the pit would have been simultaneously backfilled with stones and earth to secure its base. It was a process that required immense care, precision, and a deep, intuitive understanding of the principles of physics, of mass, leverage, and the center of gravity, while the raising of the pillars was a feat of raw power and mechanics. The artistic carving that adorned them was a feat of delicate skill and immense patience. Most of the intricate relief carvings were likely done after the pillars were erected in their final positions. This allowed the artist to create a coherent and unified decorative scheme across the entire enclosure. The carver's toolkit was simple but effective. The main tool would have been a burin, a small, sharp, pointed flint tool, perfect for incising lines and for the delicate work of carving the high reliefs. To lower the background, leaving the animal figures standing out, the artist would have used a combination of pecking with a hard stone pounder and scraping with flint tools. It would have been a slow, subtractive process, requiring a steady hand and a clear vision of the final image. The dust-filled, noisy work of the quarryman would have given way to the quiet, focused, and highly skilled work of the master carvers, transforming the mute architectural stones into living, symbolic beings done to accomplish all of this: the quarrying, the transport, the erection, and the carving required more than just an understanding of engineering. It required a new and revolutionary social technology. A project of this scale could not have been accomplished by a single, small, independent band of foragers. It would have required the coordinated labor of hundreds of people, drawn from many different social groups across a wide region. This implies a level of social organization and cooperation that was previously thought to be impossible for hunter-gatherer societies. There must have been a system of leadership, a way of making collective decisions and organizing large workforces. There must have been a shared ideology, a powerful set of religious beliefs that could motivate so many people to dedicate so much of their time and energy. to a project with no immediate economic benefit. And there must have been a system for feeding and provisioning this massive, temporary workforce. The nature of the leadership at Göbekli Tepe is one of the site's most intriguing mysteries. There is no evidence of a single, powerful king or a centralized, hierarchical state. There are no palaces, no royal tombs, and no administrative buildings. The leadership was likely of a very different, and perhaps more ephemeral nature. It is possible that the project was managed by a council of elders, representing the different clans or social groups who participated. Or perhaps the authority rested with a special class of charismatic and powerful ritual specialists, or shamans. These individuals, who were believed to have a special connection to the spirit world, may have been the ones who had the vision for the great enclosures and the authority to command the labor of the community to build them. The power of these early religious leaders would have been based not on coercion or military might, but on their perceived spiritual power and their ability to successfully mediate between the human and divine worlds. The gatherings at Göbekli Tepe were likely seasonal. The hunter-gatherer groups would have followed their traditional nomadic rounds for much of the year, but at certain pre-arranged times, perhaps corresponding to astronomical events like the solstice or equinox, they would have converged on the sacred hill. These gatherings would have been periods of intense social and ritual activity. There would have been a time for different groups to meet, to exchange goods, to share information, and to arrange marriages, thus maintaining the social and genetic health of the wider regional population. But the central activity would have been the communal participation in the building and ritual life of the great enclosures. The very act of working together on a monumental project would have been a powerful force for social cohesion. It would have taken individuals from disparate, wandering bands and forged them, at least temporarily, into a single, unified community with a shared identity and a shared purpose. The construction of the temple was a technology for constructing the society itself. The question of how this massive, temporary population was fed is central to understanding the site's significance. A single person requires a certain number of calories per day to perform hard physical labor. Multiplying that by several hundred workers over a period of weeks or months gives you a staggering logistical challenge. All of this food had to be acquired from the wild. The archaeological evidence provides a clear answer. It was done through mass industrial-scale hunting. The vast quantities of animal bones found at the site are not from a wide variety of species. They are overwhelmingly from a single species, the gazelle, and the bones often show evidence of having been butchered and cooked on a massive scale. This suggests that the people of Göbekli Tepe were not just casual hunters. They were organizing huge, coordinated, communal hunts. They would have had to work together to drive vast herds of gazelle into specially constructed traps or enclosures, known as desert kites, where they could be slaughtered in large numbers. The meat would then have been brought to the sacred hill to be cooked and consumed in massive, ceremonial feasts. The evidence for this large-scale feasting is one of the most important discoveries at the site. The fill that was used to bury the enclosures is not sterile earth. It is a dense archaeological deposit packed with millions of fragments of animal bone, along with flint tools and other debris. These are the leftovers from the meals that fueled the builders and the pilgrims. Archaeologists have even found large trough-like limestone vessels at the site, some with a capacity of up to 160 liters. Chemical analysis of the residues found in these vessels has revealed the presence of calcium oxalate, a byproduct of the fermentation of grain to make beer. It seems that the gatherings at Göbekli Tepe were not sober, solemn affairs. They were great festivals, accompanied by the consumption of vast quantities of roasted gazelle and the world's earliest known beer. This beer would have been a thick, nutritious, and mildly alcoholic gruel, a vital source of calories, and a social lubricant for these great communal gatherings. The feast was not just a way of feeding the workers. It was a central part of the ritual itself. In many traditional societies, the communal feast is a powerful social and political tool. The leader or host who can provide a lavish feast for his followers demonstrates his wealth, his generosity, and his power. The act of sharing food and drink creates powerful social bonds and obligations. The feasts at Göbekli Tepe were likely competitive and ostentatious displays of prowess. The group that could bring the most meat or sponsor the grandest feast would have gained immense prestige. This competitive feasting may have been a major driving force behind the monumental construction, as different social groups vied with one another to build the most impressive pillar or enclosure as a demonstration of their power and piety. The site was a theater for social competition, and the feast was one of the main events. The social structure that made all of this possible was likely what anthropologists call a complex hunter-gatherer society. This is a type of society that challenges the old stereotype of foragers as simple, egalitarian, and constantly on the move. Under conditions of environmental abundance, some hunter-gatherer societies can develop many of the traits that we traditionally associate with agricultural societies. They can become sedentary or semi-sedentary. They can have high population densities, and they can develop social hierarchies with powerful chieftains or shamans who command the labor of their communities. They can also engage in long-distance trade and create elaborate art and ritual. Göbekli Tepe is the ultimate spectacular proof that such complex hunter-gatherer societies not only existed, but that they were capable of a level of monumental, coordinated achievement that rivals that of the later, state-level agricultural societies. The implications of this are profound. It suggests that the human capacity for complex social organization, for religious ideology, and for monumental expression is not a product of the agricultural revolution. These are much older and more deeply rooted aspects of the human experience. The people of Göbekli Tepe had the same cognitive and social potential as any modern human. They were not primitive in their thinking. They were simply working with a different technological and economic toolkit. Their achievement forces us to abandon the old, progressivist, and somewhat condescending view of hunter-gatherers as simple people living a simple life. It reveals that the path to civilization was not a single, straight line, but a far more complex and varied journey, with different peoples in different parts of the world experimenting with a wide variety of social and economic solutions. The mystery of Göbekli Tepe is therefore not just an archaeological puzzle. It is a deep philosophical question about the very nature of humanity. What is it that drives a society to invest such an immense amount of its collective energy into a project with no apparent practical or economic return? The construction of Göbekli Tepe was, in a purely material sense, a colossal waste of time and resources. Yet for over 1,000 years it was the central defining project of their world. The answer must lie in the power of a shared idea, a shared belief system, the need to come together, to participate in a communal ritual, to build a house for their gods or ancestors, and to feel a part of something larger than themselves, was a force so powerful that it could literally move mountains of stone. It suggests that the need for meaning, for a shared cosmology, is not a luxury that comes after the practical problems of life have been solved. It is a fundamental, and perhaps even the primary, driver of human social evolution. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were, in the end, the first great architects of the human community. They were working with the raw materials of the Stone Age, with flint, with limestone, with wood, and with rope. But the true materials they were shaping were human beings. They were developing the social technologies of cooperation, of leadership, and of ideology that were necessary to bind hundreds of individuals into a coherent and effective whole. The great stone circles were not just a result of this new social organization. They were the very means by which it was achieved. The shared labor, the communal feasts, and the awe-inspiring rituals were the crucible in which a new and more complex form of human society was being forged. The builders of the world's first cathedral were, in the very same act, building the foundations for a new kind of world. For over a century, the story of the dawn of civilization has been anchored by a single, seemingly unshakable event, the invention of agriculture. The Neolithic Revolution, as the great archaeologist V. Gordon Childe termed it, was seen as the prime mover, the great economic catalyst that propelled humanity out of the long, slow stasis of the Paleolithic and into the dynamic, fast-paced world of villages, cities, and states. The logic was simple and compelling. The domestication of plants and animals provided a stable, reliable, and expandable food source. This allowed for settled life, which in turn led to population growth, social complexity, and eventually the luxury of building monumental structures like temples. In this narrative, economics was the engine, and culture, religion, and art were the beautiful but secondary passengers. But Göbekli Tepe, with its massive pre-agricultural temples, presents us with a profound and challenging paradox. It gives us the grand cathedral before the farm, the complex religious society before the economic revolution that was supposed to make it possible. This has led to the formulation of a truly radical and paradigm-shifting hypothesis, a theory most famously championed by the site's discoverer, Klaus Schmidt. What if the story we have been telling ourselves is completely backwards? What if the intense social and logistical demands of building Göbekli Tepe and of feeding the thousands who gathered there was not a result of the agricultural revolution, but was in fact its primary cause? To understand this revolutionary idea, we must first revisit the central activity that seems to have defined life at Göbekli Tepe, the feast. As we have seen, the fill that was used to bury the great enclosures is a vast archaeological midden, a record of the consumption that took place at the site. It is packed with the shattered and cooked bones of tens of thousands of wild animals, primarily gazelle and aurochs. The scale of this consumption is almost industrial. This was not the debris from a few families having their daily meal. This was the refuge from massive periodic gatherings, where hundreds or even thousands of people came together for great ceremonial feasts. These feasts were not just a way to feed the workforce. They were likely a central part of the ritual and social life of the site. They were a tool for building community, for displaying social status, and for mobilizing the immense labor force needed for the monumental construction projects. A leader's prestige would have been measured by the lavishness of the feast he could provide, creating a dynamic of competitive feasting, each group trying to outdo the others in a grand display of their hunting prowess and generosity. The logistical challenge of providing for these feasts would have been immense. The primary source of meat, the gazelle, was a migratory animal, moving in vast herds across the plains. To secure the sheer quantity of meat needed for a single large-scale feast would have required a level of hunting organization far beyond that of a small, independent band. The hunters of Göbekli Tepe would have had to organize and execute massive, coordinated, communal hunts. The most likely method they used was the desert kite. These are vast, stone-built structures found throughout the deserts of the Near East. They consist of two long, low stone walls, sometimes stretching for several kilometers, that converge into a narrow funnel leading into a circular or polygonal killing enclosure. A team of hunters would work together to stampede a herd of gazelle towards the wide mouth of the kite. As the panicked animals were funneled into the ever-narrowing corridor, they would be driven into the final enclosure, where they would be trapped and could be slaughtered in huge numbers. This was a highly effective but resource-intensive method of hunting, requiring the cooperation of a large and well-organized group of people. While these communal hunts could provide a massive, short-term influx of meat, they were not a sustainable, long-term solution. The repeated, large-scale slaughter of the local gazelle herds would have inevitably put immense pressure on their populations. Over the centuries that Göbekli Tepe was in use, the local game would have become depleted, forcing the hunters to travel further and further afield. The feast, the very engine of social and ritual life at the site, was creating an ecological crisis. The demand for resources was beginning to outstrip the natural supply. This is the critical point where Schmidt's theory comes into play. The leaders or shamans of Göbekli Tepe, faced with the growing challenge of provisioning their great gatherings, would have been under immense social pressure to find a new, more reliable and more productive food source. The old, mobile way of life based on following the wild herds and gathering the wild plants was no longer sufficient to support the new, centralized, and demanding ritual economy they had created. The potential solution to this problem was growing all around them. The region of southeastern Anatolia, where Göbekli Tepe is located, is part of a wider geographical zone known as the Fertile Crescent. And it is in this very region that the wild ancestors of the first domesticated plants, einkorn wheat, emmer wheat, and barley grew in abundance. For millennia, the hunter-gatherers of the area had been harvesting these wild cereals as part of their diet. They knew their properties, they knew where they grew, and they knew how to process them into food. The crucial difference between wild and domesticated cereals lies in a few key genetic traits. Wild wheat and barley have a brittle rachis, the stem that holds the grain to the stalk. When the grain is ripe, a slight touch or a gust of wind will cause the rachis to shatter, scattering the seeds on the ground. This is great for the plant's reproduction, but very inefficient for a human harvester who loses much of the grain. Domesticated cereals, on the other hand, have a tough rachis, the result of a genetic mutation that prevents the seeds from scattering. This means a farmer can harvest the entire head of grain with a sickle with minimal loss. The traditional model of domestication assumed that this was a long, slow, and largely unintentional process. As people harvested wild grains, they would have accidentally selected for the tough rachis mutants, as these would have been the ones that made it back to their settlements in greater numbers. Over many generations, this unconscious selection would have gradually led to the emergence of fully domesticated crops. But the crisis at Göbekli Tepe may have provided the impetus to dramatically accelerate this process. Faced with the need to feed a large, concentrated population, the organizers of the feasts would have had a powerful incentive to not just gather the wild cereals, but to actively cultivate them. They would have had a reason to start clearing land, planting the seeds of the most productive plants, and tending them to ensure a larger and more reliable harvest. The world's first farms may have been, in essence, temple gardens created not for subsistence, but to supply the ritual economy of a great ceremonial center. The evidence for this is circumstantial, but highly suggestive. The area around Göbekli Tepe is a hot spot of early agricultural origins. The slopes of the nearby Karakadak Mountain, a now extinct volcano visible from the hill, have been identified through genetic analysis as the very place where the single domestication event for einkorn wheat, one of the first and most important Neolithic crops, took place. The timing is also a perfect fit. The first evidence for the appearance of domesticated wheat in the archaeological record in the wider region occurs in the centuries immediately following the peak of construction and activity at Göbekli Tepe, around the 9th millennium BCE. The great temple complex was flourishing just before and during the very window of time that the agricultural revolution was getting underway in its backyard. The correlation is not proof of causation, but it is an incredibly powerful and provocative one. This religion first, or temple-led theory of agricultural origins, is a complete inversion of the traditional materialist model. It suggests that the primary driver of one of the most significant economic transformations in human history was not a desire for a better diet or a more secure subsistence, but the demands of a complex and ambitious religious ideology. It was the desire to build and sustain a sacred place, to gather and feast in the name of the gods or the ancestors, that created the problem to which agriculture was the solution. The cognitive revolution, the development of a complex, symbolic world, and the social organization to express it monumentally, came first. The economic revolution was a consequence of the cultural one. Humanity did not invent farming and then build a temple. It seems we built a temple, and then we had to invent farming to support it. This hypothesis also helps to explain a long-standing puzzle about the early history of agriculture. For a long time, archaeologists and anthropologists have debated why hunter-gatherers would have ever voluntarily adopted farming in the first place. From the perspective of an individual, early farming was a terrible bargain. It was far more labor-intensive than foraging. It led to a less diverse and often less nutritious diet, heavily reliant on a few starchy cereals. Early farming populations were often smaller, sicklier, and had a lower life expectancy than their hunter-gatherer neighbors. As the crowded conditions of village life and the close proximity to domesticated animals led to a dramatic increase in infectious diseases. So why do it? The conventional answer was that it was a response to environmental stress or population pressure. But the Göbekli Tepe model offers a new and compelling answer. They did it not because they were hungry, but because they had to. The social and religious demands of their new, centralized ritual system had locked them into a demographic and logistical trap. And agriculture was the only way out. The evidence for the consumption of cereals and their transformation into food and drink is also present at the site. While heavy grinding stones are rare on the hilltop itself, which makes sense if it was not a domestic settlement, archaeologists have found numerous stone basins and troughs that would have been used for the large-scale processing of plant materials. And as we have seen, the chemical evidence for beer production is strong. The creation of beer from wild grains was another major technological process. It would have required the grain to be malted, sprouted, and then dried, crushed, mixed with water, and then left to ferment. The resulting beer would have been a thick, porridge-like substance, highly nutritious and mildly alcoholic. The production of enough beer for a feast of hundreds would have required a huge and reliable supply of grain. The incentive to cultivate cereals not just for bread, but for the socially and ritually crucial beverage of beer may have been another powerful driver towards domestication. The feast needed not only its meat, but its intoxicating and communal drink. The social implications of this transition, driven by the demands of the temple, would have been profound and irreversible. The shift to an agricultural economy created a new relationship with the land. Hunter-gatherers had a deep and intimate knowledge of a vast territory. Farmers, by contrast, were tied to a single small plot of land. This created a new concept of property, of ownership, and of inheritance. The success of a harvest was not guaranteed. It was dependent on the weather, on pests, and on the favor of the gods, which in turn likely increased the power of the shamans and priests who claimed to be able to mediate with those divine forces. The surplus grain that was produced had to be stored, protected, and redistributed, which required a new class of administrators and created new opportunities for the accumulation of wealth and power. The agricultural revolution, even if it began as a solution to a ritual problem, quickly created a whole new set of social and political structures that would pave the way for the hierarchical states of the later Neolithic and Bronze Age. The story of Göbekli Tepe does not end with the first experiments in cultivation. The site continued to be used for over 1,000 years, a period that saw the full flowering of the agricultural revolution in the surrounding region. The later layers of the site, built on top of and around the great early enclosures, tell a different story. In this later period, the monumental circular enclosures are replaced by smaller rectangular buildings. The massive T-shaped pillars are still present, but they are much smaller, typically no more than 1.5 meters high. The art is still present, but it is less frequent and often of a lower quality. The entire site seems to have been scaled down. This has been interpreted as a shift in the religious and social life of the region. The great central pan-regional cathedral was being replaced by smaller, local parish churches. As farming took hold, communities became more tied to their specific lands, and their ritual life may have become more localized as well. The great unifying project of Göbekli Tepe was no longer the central focus of their world. This shift also coincides with a change in the symbolic universe of the people of the Neolithic. While the art of Göbekli Tepe is dominated by the powerful, dangerous, and overwhelmingly male world of the hunter, the art of the later agricultural Neolithic sites, such as the famous settlement of Cathedral in central Anatolia, is dominated by a very different set of symbols. At Cathedral, the primary images are of buxom, powerful female figures, the so-called mother goddesses, and of the massive domesticated bull. The wild, male-centric menagerie of Göbekli Tepe has been replaced by a new cosmology, one that seems to be focused on the themes of fertility, birth, and the powerful domestic bull. This represents a profound ideological shift. The world of the hunter was giving way to the world of the farmer and the herder, and their gods and symbols were changing with them. The decline in the importance of Göbekli Tepe may be a direct reflection of this great cultural and religious transformation. So, was Göbekli Tepe the single birthplace of agriculture? It is probably more complex than that. The transition to farming was not a single event, but a long and messy process that occurred at different paces in different parts of the Fertile Crescent. But the evidence strongly suggests that Göbekli Tepe and the unique social and religious system it represents played a critical, and perhaps even a central, role in that process. It created a powerful new incentive for the intensification of resource exploitation. It created a context in which the large-scale cultivation of cereals was not just possible, but necessary. It acted as a social and demographic crucible, a place where new ideas and technologies could be developed and exchanged. It may not have been the only place where these experiments were happening, but it was for a time the spectacular and monumental epicenter of this new world in the making. This new understanding of the Neolithic has profound implications for how we view the relationship between culture and economics in human history. The old materialist view saw culture as a kind of superstructure, a secondary phenomenon that was built upon the primary foundation of the economic mode of production. In this view, you first change how people get their food, and then their religion and society will change as a result. Göbekli Tepe suggests a very different model, one in which the causal arrow can point in the other direction. It suggests that what people believe, their cosmology, their rituals, their shared sense of the sacred, can be a powerful, and perhaps even the primary force for economic and technological change. It was the desire to build a house for their gods that led humanity to rebuild the very economic foundations of its world. This is a far more complex and interesting story, one that gives a much greater role to human agency, to ideology, and to the power of a shared idea. We can see echoes of this dynamic in later history. The construction of the great Gothic cathedrals in medieval Europe, for example, was an immense economic undertaking that spurred the development of new engineering technologies, new systems of finance, and new forms of labor organization. The desire to glorify God was a powerful engine of economic and technological innovation. The same could be said of the space race in the 20th century, the ideological and political competition to reach the moon drove a massive investment in scientific research and led to a host of technological breakthroughs that had a profound impact on our economy and society. The project was not driven by a direct economic need, but by a powerful, quasi-religious sense of national destiny and human exploration. Göbekli Tepe is perhaps the earliest and most dramatic example of this powerful feedback loop between a society's grandest, most useless projects and its most profound and practical transformations. The revolution that may have begun at Göbekli Tepe was, in the end, a double-edged sword. The invention of agriculture was the key that unlocked the door to the modern world. It allowed for the population growth, the technological development, and the social complexity that led to cities, states, and empires. But it also created a host of new problems. It led to a less healthy and more monotonous diet. It created new forms of social inequality, of property, and of power, with a small elite controlling the land and the surplus, and a large peasantry providing the labor. And it created a new and often destructive relationship with the environment. As forests were cleared, soils were depleted, and the delicate balance of the natural ecosystem was irrevocably altered. The people who gathered at Göbekli Tepe, in their attempt to solve the logistical problems of their religious system, may have inadvertently set humanity on a new and irreversible path, a path that would lead to all the glories and all the problems of civilization. And so, the image of the feast at Göbekli Tepe becomes a powerful and poignant metaphor for the entire Neolithic transition. We can imagine the scene, a great, joyous, and boisterous gathering on the sacred hilltop. Hundreds of people who have traveled for days are gathered in the firelight, surrounded by the silent, watching forms of the great stone pillars. They are feasting on roasted gazelle, drinking the thick, intoxicating beer brewed from the first cultivated grains, and celebrating the power of their community and the favor of their gods. It is a moment of immense social and religious energy, the culmination of their collective efforts. But it is also a moment of profound and unknowing transformation. The very success of their ritual system, the very lavishness of their feasts, is creating the pressures that are pushing them towards a new and utterly different way of life. They are, in a sense, feasting at the end of a world, and the seeds of the new world are in the very grain they are using to brew their beer. It is a moment of triumph, but also a moment of no return. Every great story has an end, and the story of Göbekli Tepe is no exception. For more than 1,500 years, this remarkable place was the ritual heart of a hunter-gatherer world, a great cathedral on a hill where communities gathered to build, to feast, and to worship. But around the year 8000 BCE, this long era of monumental construction and grand ceremony came to a close. And it did not end as one might expect, through a slow process of abandonment and decay, with the great stone circles gradually surrendering to the wind, the rain, and the passage of time. Instead, the final chapter of Göbekli Tepe is its most enigmatic of all. The people who had worshipped there, the descendants of those who had invested such immense effort to raise the great pillars, undertook one last colossal act of labor. They deliberately and systematically buried their own sanctuary. They entombed their sacred world, under a mountain of earth and debris, a final, monumental act that would hide the site from human eyes and preserve it in a silent time capsule for the next 10,000 years. This ritual burial is the last great mystery of the Potbelly Hill, a final, silent statement whose meaning we are still struggling to comprehend. The evidence for this deliberate backfilling is unambiguous and is one of the most striking features of the site's archaeology. The great circular enclosures of the early monumental phase were not found empty by their excavators. They were filled, from floor to the very top of the pillars, with a dense, tightly packed mixture of debris. This was not the fine, wind-blown sand of a site slowly reclaimed by the desert, nor was it the sterile rubble of a collapsed ruin. The fill is a rich archaeological deposit in its own right, a man-made mixture of millions of limestone fragments, ranging from fist-sized chunks to larger blocks, all of them the apparent waste product of the quarrying and shaping of the pillars. Mixed in with this stone debris are vast quantities of flint tools' broken arrowheads, scrapers, and the waste flakes from tool production, and, most tellingly, countless thousands of shattered and cooked animal bones, the leftovers from the great feasts. This was the accumulated refuse of the very activities that had defined the life of the site, a kind of sacred garbage. The act of burial was not a simple act of concealment. It was an act of offering, a final, massive deposition of the material culture of their world back into the sacred space. The scale of this undertaking was immense, rivaling the effort of the original construction. To fill a single one of the large enclosures, like enclosure D, would have required the transport of hundreds of cubic meters of material weighing many hundreds of tons. This was not a small-scale clandestine act. It would have required a massive organized workforce, toiling for a considerable period of time. It was a communal project, a final great act of labor performed at the site. The way the fill was deposited also suggests a deliberate and perhaps ritualized process. The material seems to have been brought in and dumped from the edges of the enclosures, flowing down towards the center in layered deposits. The fact that the fragile limestone pillars have survived in such a remarkable state of preservation is another testament to the care with which this was done. They were not violently thrown down or destroyed. They were gently and respectfully entombed, their stone bodies protected by the very earth that was burying them. This was not an act of desecration or destruction. It was an act of closure, of careful and intentional concealment. This deliberate burial is the primary reason for Göbekli Tepe's astonishing state of preservation. By entombing the site, its last users created an anaerobic, protected environment that shielded the delicate limestone carvings from the destructive effects of wind, rain, and frost for 10 millennia. It was a paradoxical act of preservation through burial. Without it, the pillars would have long since weathered into shapeless stumps, their intricate carvings erased by the elements. This final act, whatever its original intention, is the reason that we today can gaze upon the art and architecture of this lost world with such stunning clarity. The builders of Göbekli Tepe not only created one of the world's most remarkable sacred sites, they also ensured its survival, turning their temple into a time capsule, a message in a bottle for a future they could not possibly have imagined. But this only deepens the central question. Why? Why would a society that had invested so much of its identity, its energy, and its resources into a single place for over 60 generations choose to deliberately and permanently hide it from the world? This is perhaps the most debated question among the archaeologists who work at the site, and there are several competing theories, each of which opens a fascinating window into the possible mindset of these late Stone Age people. The first, and perhaps simplest, explanation is that the site was decommissioned because its ritual power had come to an end. In many traditional belief systems, sacred objects and places have a kind of life cycle. They are powerful for a time, but that power can fade or become dangerous or simply be exhausted. The burial of Göbekli Tepe may have been a way of respectfully and safely putting the sanctuary to rest. It was a ritual to mark the end of an era, a way of neutralizing the immense sacred power of the site and allowing it to die a good death. The burial was a funeral, a final, great ceremony for the temple itself. This idea of a sacred life cycle is supported by evidence from within the enclosures themselves. It appears that the circular structures were not all built and used at the same time in a single sprawling complex. Instead, they seem to have been built sequentially. One enclosure would be the focus of ritual life for a few centuries, and then it would be deliberately buried, and a new one would be built nearby. We can see evidence of this in the way that some of the later enclosure walls cut into and are built on top of the fill of the earlier, buried enclosures. This suggests that the act of ritual burial was an integral part of the site's long-term use. It was a process of cyclical death and rebirth. The burial of an old enclosure may have been the necessary precondition for the construction of a new one, a way of transferring the sacred energy from the old to the new. The final burial of the entire site then would have been the last of these cycles, the moment when the community decided not to build a new enclosure, but to close the book on this sacred place forever, a second and not mutually exclusive theory is that the burial of Göbekli Tepe was a response to a profound cultural and ideological shift. The 1,500 years that the site was in use was a period of immense and rapid change across the Near East. This was the very period that saw the full development of the Neolithic revolution. As we have seen, the demands of the site itself may have been a catalyst for the invention of agriculture. But once farming and animal husbandry took hold, they created a new world with new social structures, new economic realities, and very likely a new set of religious beliefs. The old, male-centric hunter's cosmology, so vividly depicted on the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, may have simply become obsolete. The new world of the farmer, with its focus on the fertility of the soil, the cycle of the seasons, and the power of the domestic herd, required a new set of gods and a new kind of religion. The art and architecture of the later Neolithic period certainly seem to support this idea of a major ideological transformation. The smaller rectangular buildings of the later layers at Göbekli Tepe itself, and the architecture of subsequent Neolithic sites like Nivali Kori and Cataluyuk, are very different from the grand, circular, communal enclosures of the early period. The focus of ritual life seems to have shifted from the great, central, regional gathering place to smaller, more localized and often household-based shrines. The symbolism also changes dramatically. The wild, aggressive, and predominantly male bestiary of Göbekli Tepe is replaced by a new set of symbols focused on the female form, the famous mother goddess figurines, and on the powerful, domesticated bull. This was a religious revolution. The burial of Göbekli Tepe may have been a conscious and deliberate act of de-paganization, a way for this new farming society to break with its own past, to bury the gods and the world of their hunter-gatherer ancestors, and to fully embrace a new identity and a new way of life. It was the closing of one Bible and the opening of another. Another intriguing possibility is that the burial was a response to some kind of traumatic event or a perceived bad omen. Ancient societies were deeply attuned to the natural world and often interpreted unusual natural events, an earthquake, a solar eclipse, a prolonged drought, the appearance of a comet, as signs of divine displeasure. The act of burying a sacred site could have been a massive, desperate act of appeasement, an attempt to placate angry gods or to neutralize a place that had become associated with a catastrophe. This is, of course, highly speculative, but it is not without precedent. The vulture stone, with its complex and seemingly narrative scene, has been interpreted by some as a depiction of a cataclysmic astronomical event. It is possible that the final burial was a response to a real or perceived cosmic disaster, a way of closing a portal to a dangerous spirit world that had become hostile, a more mundane but still plausible explanation is that the site was simply becoming too much of a burden to maintain. The competitive feasting and building that had driven the site's expansion for centuries would have placed an ever-increasing strain on the local environment and on the social fabric of the communities who supported it. The local game populations may have been hunted to near extinction. The shift to agriculture, while providing a new food source, also created new labor demands, tying people to their fields and making the long-distance pilgrimages and extended work periods at the sacred hill more difficult to sustain. The great central project may have simply collapsed under its own weight, its social and economic costs finally outweighing its perceived spiritual benefits. The burial in this scenario would have been a way of giving the site a respectful and permanent conclusion, a way of collectively agreeing to end a tradition that was no longer sustainable. The legacy of Göbekli Tepe, however, was not erased by its burial. The ideas, symbols, and architectural forms that were pioneered at the great central sanctuary continued to echo through the region for thousands of years. We see this most clearly at the nearby site of Neolithic, which flourished in the period immediately following Göbekli Tepe's decline. Here, archaeologists found a small, temple-like building with T-shaped pillars and sculptures that are clearly part of the same artistic and symbolic tradition. But the context is different. The temple at Neolithic is embedded within a permanent agricultural village. The grand communal hunter-gatherer cathedral has been replaced by a smaller local village church. This is a crucial transitional step, showing the domestication of the Göbekli Tepe ideology, its adaptation to the new realities of a settled farming way of life. We see further echoes at the famous, much later site of Cathedral in central Anatolia, which dates to the 7th millennium BCE, while the art of Cathedral is very different. with its focus on mother goddesses and painted murals. Some of the underlying cosmological concepts seem to persist. The walls of the houses at Cathedral are famous for their inclusion of oryx skulls, or bucrania, their horns covered in plaster and set into the walls. This reverence for the powerful wild bull is a clear continuation of a theme we see at Göbekli Tepe. More strikingly, the funerary practices show a similar obsession with the head, or rather the skull. At Cathedral, the dead were often buried beneath the floors of the houses, but in many cases the skulls were removed from the bodies and were curated, plastered and used in household rituals before being reburied. This special treatment of the skull, this separation of the head from the body, is a powerful echo of the headless human depictions at Göbekli Tepe. The specific beliefs may have changed, but the underlying focus on the head as the seat of a person's identity or spirit seems to be a long-lived and deeply rooted tradition that may have its origins at the great ancestral site at the story of Göbekli Tepe is, in many ways, a story that is still being written. The excavations are far from complete. The vast majority of the site, including the 16 or more enclosures identified by the geomagnetic surveys, remains buried. What has been uncovered so far is likely just the beginning, a small window into a much larger and more complex world. Future excavations will undoubtedly reveal new enclosures, new art, and new clues that will refine and perhaps once again revolutionize our understanding of the site. New scientific techniques, such as DNA analysis of the human and animal bones, and isotope analysis to determine the geographic origins of the pilgrims, will add even more detail to the picture. Göbekli Tepe is not a closed book. It is a vast, open-ended archaeological project that will keep rewriting the first chapters of the human story for decades to come. What Göbekli Tepe has already given us, however, is a profound and humbling new perspective on our own past. It has demolished the old, simplistic opposition between the primitive hunter-gatherer and the civilized farmer. It has shown us that the human capacity for complex symbolic thought, for large-scale social cooperation, and for the creation of monumental, awe-inspiring art is not a recent development. These are ancient and fundamental aspects of the human spirit. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not brutish cavemen. They were anatomically and cognitively modern humans, with the same intelligence, the same creativity, and the same deep need for meaning as us. They were grappling with the same fundamental questions of life, death, and the cosmos that we still grapple with today, and they answered those questions with a confidence and a monumental power that is truly breathtaking. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe also serves as a powerful reminder of the fragility of our own knowledge and the hubris of our own assumptions. For decades, the story of the Neolithic revolution was a settled and comfortable fact, a cornerstone of our understanding of the past. Göbekli Tepe has shown us that the past is always more complex, more surprising, and more mysterious than we think. It has forced an entire generation of scholars to go back to their textbooks and to rethink their most basic assumptions. It is a lesson in the importance of being open to new evidence, even and especially when that evidence contradicts our most cherished theories. The story of Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who was able to see a megalithic temple where others saw only a ruined cemetery, as a testament to the power of a prepared and open mind. The past speaks to us, but we can only hear it if we are willing to listen. In the end, we are left with the final silent act of the people of Göbekli Tepe, the burial. It is an act that seems to speak to a deep and perhaps unsettling truth about the nature of civilization. It suggests that cultures, like living organisms, have a life cycle. They are born, they flourish, and they die. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not trying to create a monument that would last forever in the eyes of man. They were not building for a distant future. Their project was for the here and now, for their own community, for their own gods. And when its time was over, they did not cling to it. They gave it back to the earth. There is a profound and perhaps even an environmental wisdom in this act, a recognition that all human endeavors are ultimately temporary and that our creations must, in the end, return to the landscape from which they came. We can imagine the scene of that final ceremony. A great crowd has gathered on the Potbelly Hill for the last time. The fires are lit, the beer is poured, and the final feast is shared. But instead of the percussive sound of flint on limestone, there is a new sound, the sound of 1,000 baskets of earth and rubble being tipped into the great enclosures. Slowly, methodically, the sacred circles are filled. The carved animals, the foxes, the snakes, the boars, disappear one by one into the darkness. The great, faceless T-pillars, the stone ancestors who have watched over their people for 60 generations, are gradually submerged, their heads the last to go, until they too are gone. It is not an act of sadness or of failure. It is an act of closure, of completion. The great cycle has come to an end. The world has changed, and a new era, the era of the farmer, has begun. The people turn their backs on the hill and walk away, leaving their cathedral to its long, silent sleep, its duty done, its secrets safely kept for the future. Our journey into the mystery of Göbekli Tepe ends where it began, on this lonely, pot-bellied hill in southern Turkey. We have walked through its discovery, marveled at its strange and powerful art, and contemplated the immense social and engineering challenges of its construction. We have explored the revolutionary idea that this place was not a product of the agricultural revolution, but perhaps its very cause, and we have stood before the final enigma of its deliberate ritual burial. We came here seeking the origins of a temple, and what we found were the origins of a new story about ourselves. We have learned that the neat, linear progression of human history that we held so dear, first farming, then settlement, then civilization and religion, is a fiction. Göbekli Tepe has shattered that timeline. It has shown us that the human hunger for meaning, for a connection to the cosmos, for a shared sacred space, is not a luxury of a settled, civilized life. It is a primal and powerful force in its own right, a force capable of inspiring a society of hunter-gatherers to organize themselves on a vast scale and to achieve the seemingly impossible. The temple, it seems, came before the town, and the desire to feed the gods may have been what taught us how to feed the world. We have been forced to reconsider our own condescending view of the Stone Age mind. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not the brutish, primitive cavemen of our cartoons. They were us. They were anatomically modern humans, with the same cognitive capacities for abstract thought, for complex planning, and for profound artistic expression. They were astronomers, engineers, artists, and theologians who mapped their cosmology onto the living rock and built a social and religious world of a complexity we are only just beginning to comprehend. They were not at the dawn of human intellect. They were the inheritors of a deep and ancient stream of knowledge that stretched back hundreds of thousands of years. And finally, we are left with their last silent act, the burial. In this final, monumental effort, they gave their sacred creation back to the earth, turning their cathedral into a time capsule. It was an act of profound closure, a recognition, perhaps, that their world had changed, and that a new way of life, the life of the farmer, required a new set of beliefs. But in burying their temple, they ensured its preservation, leaving us a single, astonishingly preserved chapter from a book we never even knew was written. Göbekli Tepe is more than just an archaeological site. It is a profound and unsettling question mark. It asks us to rethink the very nature of religion, of society, and of the forces that drive human history. It reminds us that the past is a far stranger, more complex, and more wonderful place than we can ever imagine, and that great chapters of the human story are still out there, lying silent just beneath the surface, waiting for a prepared mind to ask the right questions. The Potbelly Hill has given up some of its secrets, but its deepest mysteries and its final message are still waiting to be unearthed.